front of you as we come this morning to make our way through the teaching of this 13th chapter of Genesis. What will I have for breakfast? What will I wear? Will I drive or will I walk? Will I make a packed lunch or will I pick something up on the way? Will I work late or maybe leave early? Will I stay in and watch TV tonight or force myself out to the gym? Every day we face a multitude of decisions. Our whole lives filled with decisions and choices. From the routine, like some of those choices and decisions that I've just mentioned, to the more consequential. Decisions about the type of people that we'll be. Our careers, who we'll marry, where we live. Life is a never-ending conveyor belt of decisions and choices, just one after another. And our passage today that we come to in our study of Abraham, the life of Abraham, gives us principles and it gives us warnings for making decisions. And how Abram and Lot make their decisions about where they're going to go whenever they separate. We are given principles, we're given warnings for making our decisions and our choices. And the title that I've given our study of this passage today is Life Choices. Life Choices. In Abram and Lot, we have two very different men. Men with different attitudes, different mindsets and outlooks, different principles by they reach their decisions. Principles that lead to very different decisions. Different decisions that have very different and far-reaching consequences for them. Men with different principles who make different picks, which have very different payoffs. Those are 3 points. Different principles that lead to different picks that have very different payoffs. Those are our headings. Firstly, different principles. Different principles. Abram and Lot exhibit very different principles in this passage. Different mindsets, different attitudes, different priorities. Now, that being said, they're also very similar. How are they similar? Well, they're both believers. They're both believers. This isn't a case of contrasting choices that are made by a Christian and a non-Christian. Abraham, the Christian who trusts God, and Lot, who doesn't. Both these men are believers. In 2 Peter 2, despite what we're going to learn about Lot as we read on and we study further the life of Abram and Lot in Genesis, we're going to learn about his faults and his failings. Despite all that we're going to learn about him, Peter in 2 Peter 2 describes Lot as a righteous man. A man who was right with God through faith in God and God's promised Savior. He trusted God. He was a believer. And that in itself is a warning to us today. It's not just non-Christians who make bad decisions. We've seen that already today. It's not just non-Christians who make poor decisions based on poor principles that bring devastating consequences. It's possible for God's people. His blood-bought people, loved people, and forgiven people, it's possible for them to make poor decisions based on poor principles which have devastating consequences for ourselves, for our families, and for the church. As we come to this passage today, there's no room for complacency in any of us. There's no room for pride either in any of us. We're both susceptible. All of them, we're all susceptible to what we read and see in this passage today. Abram and Lot were both believers, but they reached the decisions that made here in this passage on the basis of very different principles. How do their principles differ? Well, firstly, Abraham was generous while Lot was greedy. Abraham was generous while Lot was greedy. Abram, remember, is the leader of this little family group. He's Lot's uncle. having taken Lot under his wing on the death of Lot's father, quite possibly taking Lot into his family under his wing to be his heir. Remember, Abram and Sarah had no children of their own, so quite possibly he looked upon Lot as a son, as an heir. Abram the uncle, Lot the nephew, Abram the senior, Lot very much a junior. And that being the case, Abram as the head of the family, he had the right to first choice of where he'd settle in Canaan, didn't he? And furthermore, God had promised that it would be Abraham's descendants who'd possess the land of Canaan. It was to Abraham and his descendants whom God had made his wonderful promise in Genesis chapter 12. And God's promise gave him, Abram, first choice over where to settle in the land. The land, after all, was ultimately, it was his. But Abram, the more senior man, the one to whom God had promised the land, defers to his nephew. He says, Lot, you pick first. You pick first. An act of incredible generosity. And having been given first pick, Lot doesn't react with corresponding generosity, a similar show of generosity. He doesn't say, no, uncle, no. You're more senior. You're the one God called and brought to this land. You're the one to whom God made this promise, whose descendants is going to possess and live in this land. You have the right to first pick. He didn't, okay, uncle, I'll do what you say, but then go ahead and choose an area of land that's appropriate for his status as Abram's junior, leaving the best land still for Abram, his uncle. No. Given first choice, he takes full advantage and he chooses the best land for himself. Imagine a company, a huge multinational company. They're moving into a new suite of offices in a city centre skyscraper, and the CEO goes to a lowly apprentice and says, choose an office. And he chooses for himself the corner office looking out over the city, in the very top floor, the penthouse suite, as it were, of the tower block, the skyscraper. That's what Lot did. That's what Lot did. Abram was generous. Lot was greedy. And we can approach the decisions in our lives, can't we, from these two principles? Generosity or greed? Secondly, Abram was selfless and Lot was selfish. Abram was selfless while Lot was selfish. Abram thought of Lot and put Lot ahead of himself. He had every right to say, okay, Lot, I'm the boss, and I'm heading over to the Jordan Valley. You take your pick from whatever's left. He had the right to say that. But he didn't. He thought to himself, I wonder what Lot would like. I wonder where Lot would like to go. And he gave Lot first choice, putting Lot and Lot's interests and what Lot might like ahead of himself. Abram here in chapter 13 embodies the selflessness that Paul exhorts of Christians in Philippians chapter 2, where Paul writes, do nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. Abram considered Lot more important than himself. He looked to Lot's interests before his own. He said, Lot, you have first pick. Lot, on the other hand, again thought only of himself. He didn't consider Abram's higher status, the promises given to him by God, where Abram might want to go. He saw the land before him. He saw the options before him. He made a decision solely based on himself, what he wanted, his interests. Abram was selfless. Lot was selfish. And again, we too can approach the decisions in our lives from the basis of these two principles, selfless or selfish. Thirdly, Abram was directed in his decisions by heavenly reality, while Lot was only interested in the here and now. Abram was directed by heavenly realities. Lot was directed by the here and now. Abraham made his decision in faith, taking into account matters of faith. Lot made his decision purely on sight, what he saw with his eyes. Abram was influenced by spiritual factors, while Lot was concerned only with the material, the physical, what he saw. He took nothing into account other than what he saw, the here and now, the cold, hard financial facts, as it were, of the situation, the economic, earthly pros and cons of the options before him. And looking east to the Jordan Valley, seeing how fertile it was, plentiful grazing for his herds, plentiful water supply, how much prettier it was in that dry, arid landscape over to the west, he chose to go east. Based purely on the economic realities, the scenic advantages. We're told in verse 13 that the men of Sodom, one of the cities in the Jordan Valley, they were wicked. Lot would have known that, but that didn't factor into his thinking. The grass was greener. The tonnage per hectare was far greater. The potential for profits was greater. The views were better. Those were the only factors that he considered as he went east. Whereas Abram's decision from start to finish was based on faith. How was it based on faith? Well, in faith, knowing that God had promised him the land, in faith, knowing that it would come to his descendants, not in Abram's time, but in God's time. In faith, knowing from his bitter experience that no scheming or grasping on his part was necessary to fulfill God's promise. It wouldn't fulfill God's promise any sooner than God intended. Looking at the whole situation through eyes of faith, trusting in God's promise, that God will fulfill his promise in God's chosen time, Abram said, Lot, you pick first. Abram's decision was based on faith, not just on what he saw, not just on the purely material consideration of the options before him, but on spiritual factors, heavenly realities. Now, of course, not all decisions have a spiritual dimension. Many do, most do. But not all decisions have a spiritual dimension. Whether you do your homework now or do it after tea, unless your parents have told you to do it now, there's a spiritual dimension. Whether you go for a walk or go to the gym, not all decisions have a spiritual dimension. But where they do, and most decisions do, decisions maybe regarding your career, your home, your work, your family, what you do in your recreation time, when there's a spiritual dimension to a decision, they have to be factored in. It has to be factored in, taken into account. And that's not to say that material considerations have no relevance whatsoever, no bearing whatsoever in your decisions. You know, the pay on offer, the glorious vista from your veranda, that doesn't matter. They do matter. It is to be taken into account. But it's to be considered alongside the spiritual factor. We have to learn as God's people to look at situations and evaluate them, yes, with our physical eyes, but also with eyes of faith. Abram was generous, Lot was greedy. Abram was selfless, Lot was selfish. Abram was directed by heaven realities, while Lot was only interested in the here and now. And the principles that Abram displays here, who's he a picture of? Who's Abram a picture of here? He's a picture for us of Jesus. Generous to a fault. Selfless to a fault. Philippians 2, a description of Jesus. Put others before himself. Consider others more significant than himself. Their needs above his own. Every decision that he made directed by heavenly reality. That, as Jesus made decisions, as Abram made his decision, that is how we're to make our decisions as his people. Different principles. Second thing that we see in this passage is different picks. Different picks. And this point's mostly application of what we've been thinking of. Different picks. The different principles that these men had led to them making different choices. The principles that underlined Abram's decision-making process led to him generously and sacrificially and selflessly giving Lot the first choice. The principles that were underlying Lot's decision-making process led to him picking the most fertile and picturesque, but spiritually dangerous ground for himself. The principles that they had affected their choices. And similarly, we all make different decisions in our lives. We'll make different decisions in our lives depending on which of these principles underlie our decision-making process. Here's the application. Your decisions about your finances, whether you spend your money on yourself, whether you save it entirely for yourself, or share it with others, use it to help others and bless others, the proportion of our income that we give to the work of the church, God's kingdom, will be determined by which of these principles govern our lives, whether we're generous or greedy, whether we're selfless or selfish, whether we base our financial decisions purely on what we can see, on material considerations, or whether we take into account God's instruction, God's exhortations in His Word. Your decisions about your career, what you do with your life, again, will be determined by which of these principles govern your life. Will you be guided solely by potential earnings, by the status that a certain career will give you in the eyes of the world? Or will you ask first what God might want you to do with your gifts? Will you consider in a spirit of selflessness and generosity, how might I use my gifts to be generous towards others? And yes, God might direct you in a job you can be generous to others that's well-paying and of high status. But have you come to God with it? Your decision is not only about your career generally, but where and for whom you'll work specifically. The specifics of your job. Are you guided in the decision solely by what that company is willing to pay you, the benefits package that's on offer, without taking into account any spiritual implications of a particular job, a particular employer, a particular location? Will I be expected to work on Sundays? If I move there, is there a good church that I can attend and serve in? Well, will I move here? Will this particular job in this place, how will it affect my family? Will this job enable me to be more generous to God's kingdom, God's people, God's work? Young people, your decisions about dating, who you go out with, is your only consideration physical? Now, they have to be good looking, and really after that, that's what they have. Once they hit that standard, well, that's me. Good looking, and beyond that, it doesn't really matter. Now, I'm not saying it's not important. It is important. You have to have some sort of attraction to your husband or your wife, but there are many more spiritual considerations that go beyond the mere physical. Are they a Christian? Are they a strong Christian, a mature Christian? Will they be a help to you in your Christian life, encourage you in your Christian life? Can you raise children with this person? Whether you marry, who you marry, again, the decisions you make depend on the principles you apply. Are your principles earthly or spiritual? Is it by faith or by sight? Will you set up home? A decision you can make that's based purely on physical considerations, proximity to work and family, the transport links, local amenities, the shops, the schools, the doctors, the dentists, the coffee shops, the neighborhood, the garden, all physical consideration, without taking any spiritual considerations into account at all. Is there a good church there, where I'll be taught, where I'll enjoy fellowship, where I can serve? Selflessly, maybe choosing a small church that you can support, as many of you have done. Young people, yeah, so many of these matters, young people have decisions ahead of you. Young people, for those of you at some stage might be thinking about going off to college, university, I urge you, make that decision based not purely on material, physical considerations, but spiritual considerations. Don't only consider the university and where it is in the university league tables, the courses it offers, or the affordability of accommodation, how far that you want to get away from home, how far you can get away from home. Take spiritual consideration into account. The dangers of moving to a place without any spiritual teaching, any spiritual fellowship. Do I have the spiritual strength to go it alone on my own, so far from family and friends and my church family? The availability of a decent church, a decent fellowship you can join and be discipled in. Those things are to be factored in, taken into account. Decisions relating to your family, the time you spend with them, how you spend that time, and the input that you have, men and women, parents, in the lives of your children, are they determined by generosity, by selflessness, the spiritual principles of God's word, or by greed, by selfishness, and the demands that are placed upon you by the world? Decisions relating to your time, how you spend your time, again, those decisions, are they determined by selfishness and greed? It's all about you and the time that I need for myself, the alone time that I need. Leave me alone. Or the pursuit of a time-consuming, a finance-consuming hobby, a pastime? Or do your decisions about your time reflect the selfless, generous giving of yourself to your family, to God and his people? How you use God's day. How you use God's day, again, is determined by worldly factors. Purely that the work I can get done on a day with less pressures. You know, keeping your boss happy, the money you can earn, keeping your clients happy. The pursuit of a hobby, whatever. Or is it determined by how generous you can be towards God, seeking to honor him by obeying his word? Just a sample. That's just a sample of some of the decisions that we'll make in our lifetime. And the choices we make will be determined by the principles in our lives that are revealed in this passage. Bad principle. Greed and selfishness and faithlessness, focusing purely on the material and the earthly, what we see. Bad principles lead to bad decisions. Good principles, godly principles, and the application of those principles, selflessness, generosity, faith, will influence the choices that you make for the good. Different principles lead to different picks. And that's why it's important. It's vitally important, if you haven't done so already, to sit down at some time and determine what principles will underlie your decision. What principles will underlie the decisions that I make in life? It's important you work out those principles and seek to live by them. Different picks. Different principles, different picks. Thirdly, different payoffs. Different payoffs. Abram and Lot's different principles led to very different choices with hugely different consequences. Attracted by the fertile ground, by the pretty views, Lot, he chose the fertile Jordan Valley to the east. In Genesis, as we saw in our study of the opening 11 chapters, the east, moving to the east, always indicates a move away from God. Moving into the vicinity of Sodom with its notoriously wicked residents, Lot puts himself and his family in spiritual danger. It either didn't enter his thinking, or maybe it did, and he thought to himself, you know what, it'll be okay. I've got this. I'm strong enough. I'll not get sucked into their wicked ways. In fact, I'll witness to them. I'll be a witness to them. They need a witness. What happened? His decision to move to the Jordan Valley was the start of his spiritual decline, the spiritual decline of his family. Firstly, he moved near Sodom, in verse 12. Then he moved into Sodom in chapter 14. Then he became a member of Sodom City Council, and his daughters were engaged to men in Sodom in chapter 19. He didn't influence Sodom. Sodom influenced him, changed him. And his witness in that situation, his witness was no. And in the end, when angels had to drag him out of Sodom, him and his family out of Sodom before it was annihilated, his wife didn't want to leave. And she looked back in longing at all that she has been dragged away from. And from their sinful behavior in chapter 19 and 20, his daughters showed that they had been corrupted by the influence of being taken to Sodom. And having lost everything, we're going to read this in time, having lost everything, the wealth that had been his idol, removed, as God does with his people's idols. If we don't give them up, that is prompting, he takes them from us forcibly. And having lost everything, Lot lived out his life in a cave, living each day face to face with the consequences of his poor decision. Saved, yes. Lot was a righteous man, Peter says in 2 Peter 2, but saved by the skin of his teeth. Whereas Abram, well, okay, Abram didn't get to enjoy the grazing. He didn't get to enjoy the beautiful scenery of the Jordan Valley, the pleasures of the Jordan Valley. But as a result of his choice, God comes to him in verse 14 and he speaks to him once more. He reaffirms his promises to him and he expands on his promises. And as a result of his decision, Abram experienced, what does he experience? He experiences a closer relationship with God, a closer walk with God, an awareness of the blessing of God and the commendation of God. Those are the different consequences of our different choices that are made on the basis of different principles. The slide into sin, distance from God, God's discipline, a witness destroyed, that comes with poor decision, steady walk of obedience, an awareness of God's presence, God's closeness, God's blessing, God's commendation that comes with good decision. Your decisions, whether about your career, your finances, your priorities, whatever, your decisions made on the basis of poor principles, whether it's selfishness, greed, or without any consideration of spiritual matters, they will have consequences in your life. For yourselves and your walk with God, for your family and their walk with God, and for the church. And like Lot, very often, one poor decision leads to many poor decisions, more poor decisions, increasingly poor decisions, with increasingly destructive consequences for yourselves, your family, and the church. Whereas decisions made on the basis of godly principle, selflessness, generosity, and faith, hard though they may be at times, very hard though they may be at times, costly and sacrificial though they may be, as Abraham's decision is here, they too will bring consequences for ourselves, our family, and the church. Consequences of encouragement, God's favor, God's presence, God's commendation. And again, that's why it's important you work out now, if you haven't already done so, the principles by which you're going to make decisions and seek to live by those principles. With every decision that we make, we stand, as it were, on a hilltop, just like Abram and Lot. And the choice is the Jordan Valley to the east or the arid land to the west. And the lure of the earthly and the worldly and satisfying self, which is so attractive and appealing. The other option, well, living for God and faith, selflessness and generosity, and experiencing the hardship of that decision, and not quite as attractive, sure not? Earthly, so appealing and attractive. Choosing God appears so dry and demanding. Oh, boy, it looks as if you're giving up so much to live for God. God says to you today what he said to Abram in verse 14. Lift up your eyes, he says, and look at the land that I will give you. Lift up your eyes and look at what I have in store for you. Lift up your eyes and look in faith, Abram. Lift up your eyes, he says to us today, and look through eyes of faith on the inheritance you will receive and enjoy, not here and now, but in heaven. And for the choosing me. Making decisions of faith in your life. Though it may be hard, it may appear dry and difficult, it may appear unappealing to what the world has to offer. But boy, is it worth it. Boy, is it worth it. And it avoids the devastating consequences of poor decision. Young people, I turn to you again because, the adults in this room have made some of these decisions, and we have made at times poor decisions. These decisions, many of them, are still ahead of you. Young people, you face many decisions where the world looks so attractive and it looks so appealing, and living for God looks so pointless and dry and hard and difficult. Many decisions, maybe we think, well, I could be a Christian and I can still do that. I can go there. In fact, I'll be a witness in that place. I'll be a witness if I do that to a sinful world. Remember Lot. Young people, remember Lot and where he ended up. Ruined, empty, and his witness zero. Witness destroyed. To those of you who aren't Christians today, again, you too stand on a hilltop like Lot and Abram. And again, the valley to the east looks so attractive. Life without God, doesn't it look so attractive, looks so desirable? The land to the west, living in relationship with God, oh, it looks so boring. Looks so hard, unappealing. It's a decision with hugely contrasting consequences. Hugely contrasting consequences. For those who choose the east in the world, it brings the eternal emptiness, desolation, and ruin of hell. For those who choose life with God, brings the eternal blessing, presence, and commendation. Well done and good and faithful servant from God. May God by his grace, and may we with God's help, not in our own strength, but may we with his help, seek to develop in our lives these principles: selflessness, generosity, and faith, that enable us to make good decisions, godly decisions, by which we experience his gracious consequence. Amen.